This seems to be the natural family pattern of Melchizedek. This is how all the ancient Jews as well as the ancient church fathers understood it. Jesus Christ is not a Levite. So Old Testament Jews might be tempted to say, well, he can't be a priest then. But Hebrews is talking all about the wilderness generation under Moses and how they committed idolatry and rebelled against God, and how God sent all these punishments. The first rebellion was the golden calf, and the first punishment was to take the priesthood away from the firstborn, which had been theirs for centuries, and to give it to the Levites temporarily. What the writer of Hebrews is suggesting is that Jesus Christ, God's Son, is righteous enough to restore the original pattern of the Father-Son family priesthood. Because this is a divine family that God, through Christ, is adopting us into through the sacrifice of Christ. He's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. The word order does not mean order like the Dominican order. It means after the manner of Melchizedek's priesthood. The writer goes on to make a big, sharp contrast between the Levitical priests who continued to offer these animals in sacrifice. They had to offer, they had to kill, they had to sacrifice millions of sheep, millions of goats, and millions of cattle, with millions of gallons of blood running down through the temple. Why? It was all after and because of the golden calf, whereas before all of that, you had a father and a son and a clean priesthood that Melchizedek represents. After the manner of Melchizedek suggests that Melchizedek's manner of priestly sacrifice was bread and wine. This is how all the early fathers understood this as well. Now, it says in Hebrews 7, in verse 18, on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. On the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God. And it was not without an oath, and it talks about how God swore this oath. The oath that has been talked about is the oath that was sworn by God on Moriah, where Christ was slain. Verse 22, this makes Jesus the surety of a better covenant. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. Whereas Jesus is one, there's a single priesthood, and he lives forever up in heaven. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues a priest forever. Consequently, he is able for all times to save those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, blameless, unstained, separated from sinners, exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily. In other words, to kill and to have bloodshed continuously, first for his own sins and then for those of the people. He did this once for all when he offered up himself. Indeed, the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests. That is the Levitical law that was given after the golden calf. But the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. Now, there's a lot here I realize we can't cover, and it's very deep. But there's going to be enough here to really feed our souls if we pay close attention. Now, the point in what we are saying is this. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. Notice that the Lamb is the one enthroned in Revelation. The Lamb and the firstborn son of the Passover is the priest who ministers in a sanctuary, the heavenly sanctuary. And the true tabernacle, which is set up not by man but by the Lord. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Hence it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. I read that 100 times before the obvious meaning hit me like a brick in the face. He is a priest in heaven ministering now in the sanctuary, and he's got something to offer, and he's continually offering it. He's just not bleeding and dying and suffering anymore. He's not killing any more animals, but he's continually offering the once and for all sacrifice, which is himself. But it's a continual sacrifice. It's a perpetual offering. He's not dying, but he's still offering. That's exactly what the Catholic Church teaches about the Mass. I didn't understand that. Then I read some basic catechisms and I understood it, but I still didn't believe it. Until I studied and restudied and prayerfully re-restudied Hebrews until I saw that Jesus Christ, the firstborn son, which is the theme of the book of Hebrews, he's a much greater priest than the Levites. They replaced the sinful firstborn sons until the true and righteous firstborn son of God would come. Before we had an old covenant family on earth. Now we've got a new covenant family in heaven. A divine family. The Trinity's life is our family life. And it comes to us through God's firstborn Son, who was like Melchizedek in being a son priest. But the bread and the wine that Christ offers is not earthly flesh and blood. Earthly bread and wine, but heavenly bread, heavenly wine in the sense that it's the body and the blood of Christ. He is still to this day and forever a minister in the sanctuary. And the true tabernacle is now in heaven, which the Lord has set up. And every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices, and that is why God appointed His own Son to be high priest, to offer gifts and sacrifices. And what are they? To offer Himself and all of us in union with Him. The sacrifice isn't over. Oh baby, it's just begun. And we're going to be doing it forever in and through and with Christ. Not bloody animal sacrifices, but our hearts and our souls and our bodies in union with the one whose body and blood, soul and divinity are perfect and pure. The only acceptable sacrifice which makes our otherwise unacceptable sacrifices perfectly acceptable. Holy and righteous, Romans 12 says. He goes on talking about the superiority of the new covenant that Christ established. Now that phrase, new covenant, is a kind of odd phrase. And this really is unfortunate because we've heard the phrase new covenant hundreds and thousands of times. So we're insulated. It's almost like filters have been planted in our ears so we don't hear the significance, the spectacular meaning of the phrase new covenant. Why? Because it's only said once in the entire Old Testament. Jeremiah 31, which is what the writer of Hebrews in the rest of chapter 8 quotes from. A huge extended quote from Jeremiah 31. The days will come, says the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel. Verse 9, not like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. That covenant they broke. When? At the golden calf. The covenant that He made with them out of Egypt, they broke at the golden calf. This new covenant will not be like the golden calf in the Mosaic covenant, which was broken, because all the firstborn sons who were supposed to be serving as priests and were, say for instance in Exodus 24, but in Exodus 32, they all lost it, and the Levites got it, because the Levites had swords by which they slew 3,000 of the idolaters. Presumably, many firstborn priests were among the victims. It won't be like that covenant, because this firstborn son won't break it. And that's what makes it new. This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Verse 13, and in speaking of a new covenant, He treats the first as obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Old Testament only uses new covenant one time. Jesus, in the Gospels, only uses the phrase new covenant one time. When? At Passover time. Where? In the upper room. Why? To institute the Eucharist. Now, do you see a connection? In other words, the writer of Hebrews has focused upon the key phrase, new covenant. He's made a mountain out of a molehill if you're judging by numerical usage. One time in the Old Testament. It's not how many. It's how significant it is. Jesus only used the phrase new covenant one time, when He transformed the Old Testament covenant of Moses, the Passover covenant, by offering Himself as the unblemished lamb and the firstborn son and the priest and the king and the victim and all of it wrapped up in one. That is the new covenant. And so he goes on in Hebrews 9 to talk about the superiority. Back in the Old Testament, in verse 9, we read, according to this Old Testament arrangement, gifts and sacrifices were offered which cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper. What is the contrast implied? Back then, sacrifices were offered which couldn't perfect the worshiper's conscience, implying that in the new covenant, what? Sacrifices are offered which do perfect the conscience of the worshiper. That's what the Eucharist does. It cleanses our soul. It wipes away all venial sin.